The tray of mini quiches slid off my hand at the exact moment the woman across the garden said, "You don't actually want to be here either, do you?" And I was so caught off guard I let 4 of them hit the grass before I thought to grab the tray's edge. It wasn't a question. That was the first thing I noticed. She hadn't asked, she'd stated. And she was looking at me the way you look at someone you've been watching for a while, which was unsettling because I was fairly sure I'd arrived 7 minutes ago. I picked up 3 of the quiches. I left the 4th one. I don't know why. I put the recovered ones back on the tray with the dignity of a man who is absolutely not rattled. She was still watching me. "I'm helping," I said. "I'm supposed to be here." She tilted her head about 4 degrees to the left and said nothing. That was worse. My name is Joel Farr. I'm 34 years old. I work as a building surveyor for a mid-size firm in Bristol, which means I spend most of my professional life telling people that their dream renovation will cost twice what they think, take 3 times as long, and is already growing damp in places they haven't looked yet. It is not glamorous work. I am, by most accounts, the person who shows up to ruin your optimism. I've learned to deliver bad news with a calm face and a very specific voice, not cold, just level. It's the voice of someone who has said the same thing 100 times and genuinely wishes he didn't have to say it again. I'd been with someone for 5 years. Her name was Carol, and I will say nothing bad about Carol because there is nothing bad to say. We wanted different things by the end, which is one of those phrases that sounds like a euphemism but is sometimes just the literal truth. She wanted a city. I liked the edges of things, the towns that almost became cities but didn't quite. We sold the flat. We divided the furniture with unusual civility. She is happy now from what I can tell. I'm glad about that. Not broken, just quieter. Not closed off, just selective. I have, in the 3 years since, built what I would describe as a very functional life. A terrace house with a boiler I mostly understand, a Tuesday 5-a-side game I mostly win, and a best friend called Pete whose chaotic family I have been absorbed into, entirely against my will, in the best possible way. Pete and I met on a job site when we were 22. He is the sort of person who makes you feel like the most interesting man in any room without ever once trying. He is also the sort of person who will text you at 9 on a Saturday morning asking if you can swing by and help with a few things for his mother's 65th birthday party, and by few things means collecting 60 biodegradable napkins from a shop 20 minutes in the wrong direction, assembling a gazebo in a garden with ground the consistency of concrete, and then staying on as unofficial waiter because the actual caterer is 45 minutes late. I had said yes. I always said yes. This is how I ended up in Margaret's garden at midday on a Saturday in June, holding a tray of lukewarm quiches, wondering how I'd let a stranger stare me into dropping 4 of them on the grass. Before I go any further, if you're listening to this right now, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from. These stories have been traveling further than I ever expected, and I genuinely want to know where they're landing. All right, back to it. The garden was the kind English gardens get in late June when the weather can't commit. Warm enough to be optimistic, with a thick gray layer above the tree line promising consequences later. The roses along the back fence were outrageously, almost aggressively in bloom, deep pink, heavy-headed, slightly too much of a good thing. Someone had strung fairy lights through the hedge that wouldn't show up until dark but were already there, quietly waiting. The grass had that springy just-cut texture that meant someone had mowed it in the last 48 hours and resented every minute of it. There were maybe 30 people in the garden. Margaret, Pete's mother, was moving between clusters with the authority of someone who has thrown parties for 40 years and knows exactly where everyone needs to be even if they don't. She wore a yellow dress and had very short white hair and laughed at her own jokes first loudly, which made everyone else laugh more. Pete's aunts occupied the left side of the garden in a phalanx that was difficult to penetrate. His dad was near the barbecue offering unsolicited opinions about the temperature settings. 3 small children were doing something structural to the gazebo I had built with my own hands. I chose not to look directly at them. I'd been given the tray and the task, circulate, offer, be useful, and I'd been doing it successfully until she spoke. She was standing near the garden wall at the far end, slightly apart from the nearest group. Not sulking, there's a difference and I know it when I see it. She wasn't trying to be separate. She just was. Like she'd found the only quiet spot in the garden and was occupying it without apology. She had a glass of sparkling water in one hand and was using the other to deadhead a rose that was drooping over the wall, just quietly pinching off the spent blossoms and dropping them into the flower bed below. She hadn't asked permission. She hadn't announced it. She was just doing it because the rose needed it and no one else had noticed. That was the first thing I saw. Not her face. The rose. And her matter-of-fact relationship with it. When I did look properly, she was maybe 31, 32, with dark hair pinned back in a way that had started the day neat and was now doing its own thing, which she appeared not to mind. She had the kind of face that doesn't immediately announce itself as anything in particular, and then, a few seconds later, you realize you've been looking at it for slightly too long. There was a small ink smudge on the inside of her right wrist that she had definitely not noticed or didn't care about. Her shoes were entirely wrong for a garden party, flat leather ones with a strap across the ankle, sensible in a city, slightly sinking into the recently mown grass, and she had adjusted her stance to account for this without drawing attention to it. The 4-degree head tilt happened again as I stood there with my tray. "I didn't say you weren't supposed to be here," she said. "I said you didn't want to be." "Those aren't the same thing," I agreed. "No," she said. "They're not." There was a pause. She pinched off another dead blossom. "I'm June," she said, not looking at me. "Joel." I looked at the tray. "Do you want a quiche?" She looked at the tray, then at the 4 quiches that weren't on it, then at the grass. "Sure," she said. "I'll have one of the ones that didn't touch the ground." She was Pete's best friend from university. That was the connection I hadn't known about because Pete had described his university life to me in broad strokes that mostly involved a rowing team and a disastrous second year abroad, and June had apparently occupied the more functional portion of it that he didn't talk about as often. They'd stayed close in the ambient way. Texts, occasional visits, the kind of friendship that doesn't need constant maintenance because it was built on something sturdy. She didn't live in Bristol. She was down from Edinburgh for the weekend, specifically for this party, which explained the wrong shoes. She'd packed for one city and arrived in another. I learned all of this in the first 12 minutes between circuits of the garden with the quiche tray. She volunteered almost none of it. I deduced most of it from the 3 things she did say and the one question she asked. The question was, "How long have you known Pete?" And when I said 12 years, she said right in a way that meant she was recalibrating something. The moment that shifted things, the one that turned a perfectly ordinary conversation into something else, happened when Pete's Aunt Roberta arrived into our corner of the garden. Roberta is, by any measure, a force. She is 68 years old and has the energy of someone who has been offended by many things and has not forgiven any of them. She arrived next to June with a glass of white wine and the immediate confidence of someone who considers small talk a competitive sport. "You must be one of Pete's friends," she said to June, then before June could confirm, "Are you single, love?" I asked because I have a nephew who'd be. "I'm good, thanks," June said. Not rude. Not flustered. Just clear. Roberta was not deterred. "He's very successful. He's in finance." "I'm sure he's lovely," June said. I moved the tray to my other hand. Roberta turned to me. "And you, do you know June? Are you together?" There was a way to handle this. The normal, socially smooth way was to laugh and say no, of course not, we just met, and then let Roberta move on to someone else. That was the expected thing. The room, the garden, the party, the social script of it, expected the laugh. I said, "We're working on it." I don't know where it came from. I heard myself say it and registered distantly that I had departed from the script. Roberta looked delighted in a way that was slightly alarming. "Oh, how lovely." She patted June's arm and was absorbed back into the party. There was a silence. I looked at the tray. "Sorry? I don't know why I said that." June was quiet for a second. Then she picked up a quiche, a real one, from the middle of the tray, and bit into it. "I wasn't going to say anything," she said. Something shifted in the region of my sternum. Not a flutter. More like a weight moving slightly to one side, rearranging. "Right," I said. She chewed thoughtfully. "You could have just laughed." "I know. But you didn't." "No." She looked out across the garden toward the roses, and there was something in her expression that she almost hid. Almost. A small change, very brief. The look of someone who has just quietly updated a calculation. I moved the tray back to my original hand. For no particular reason. It became easier to keep talking to her than to stop. That sounds simple. It wasn't exactly. I am not, under normal circumstances, a person who finds it easy to talk to strangers. I do it professionally. I can deliver survey reports, I can give difficult news, I can manage the transaction of information. But the open-ended kind of conversation, the kind with no defined purpose, tends to make me aware of all my corners. I know they're there. Other people don't always know where to put them. June didn't seem to mind the corners. More than that, she seemed to have her own. We drifted, over the next hour, to the garden wall. Not by plan. The party rearranged itself and we just kept not moving, and eventually the wall was what we were leaning against, both facing the garden, shoulders roughly a foot apart. I'd surrendered the tray to Pete's dad, who had opinions about quiches that I didn't want to hear. "So what do you do?" I said. "When you're not attending parties you didn't enthusiastically want to attend." "That's a question," she said. "It's the standard question." "I know." She turned her glass. "I'm a conservator. Paintings mostly. Paper sometimes." I looked at the ink smudge on her wrist. "Occupational," she said before I could. "Do you like it?" She considered this seriously, which I hadn't expected. Most people give automatic answers to that question. She didn't. "I like the problem solving," she said. "Someone brings me something that's been damaged, water, light, time, someone who didn't know what they had, and I spend a lot of time figuring out what it was before and what I can do now that won't make it worse." Pause. Which sounds more philosophical than it is. Mostly I'm in a very quiet room with a magnifying lamp and a lot of patience. "That actually sounds like my job," I said. She raised an eyebrow. "Building surveyor. People bring me their plans for the future and I tell them what's wrong with the foundation." She looked at me for a moment. "That's a dark way to describe it." "It's an accurate way to describe it." "Do you like it?" I almost gave the automatic answer. I caught myself. "I like being useful," I said. "I don't need it to be more than that." She nodded slowly, and I had the sense she'd heard the subtext of that. The part where being useful was the thing I'd organized my expectations around because it asked less of me than the other options. She didn't comment on it. She just moved her glass to her other hand. "Edinburgh," I said. "How long?" "For years. I moved for a fellowship." "Stay because," she paused. "You know how you stay somewhere? Not because of a reason but because the reason's not to go accumulate slowly and then suddenly it's 4 years." "I know exactly what that's like," I said. We were quiet for a moment. A reasonable, comfortable quiet, the kind you don't get on a first meeting usually. I noticed it. "You don't seem like someone who usually talks this much," she said. "I don't," I said. "You don't seem surprised by that." "I'm not," she said. "I notice things." I thought about the rose. "I know." Pete appeared, carrying 2 bottles of beer, grinning in the way he grins when he's collected a piece of information he's pleased about. He handed me one and leaned on the wall between us, which destroyed the geometry of the thing, and said, "I see you two have found the anti-party corner." "Your aunt tried to set me up with her nephew," June said. "Roberta." Pete looked pained. "He's terrible. He talks about the FTSE index at breakfast." "Your friend handled it," she said and glanced at me. Pete looked at me. His grin rearranged into something more specific and far more annoying. "Did he?" Pete said. "The canapés need someone," I said. "The canapés are fine," Pete said, absolutely not moving. "The canapés have never needed anything." He stayed for 4 minutes, which was 4 minutes of pointed conversational neutrality, and then Margaret called his name from across the garden and he departed with the unhurried pace of a man who has made his point. June waited until he was out of earshot. "He's going to ask you about this later," she said. "Immediately," I said. "He's going to ask about it immediately." She almost smiled. Not quite. The corner of it arrived and then she put it away. The afternoon did what June afternoons in English gardens do. It warmed up improbably and then produced a light breeze that made everything forgivable. Someone brought out a second tray of something, and someone else put music on at a reasonable volume. The children had abandoned the gazebo in favor of a conspiracy near the rose bed that Margaret was choosing not to investigate. I found June again near the food table, reading the label on a bottle of elderflower cordial with the focused expression of someone who is reading it because she doesn't want to look like she's looking for someone. "You came back," she said without looking up. The quiches were running low. I panicked. She set the bottle down. "Joel." First time she'd used my name. I moved a plate approximately 2 inches to the left. "Were you just hovering over there waiting to come back to this table, or did you actually have somewhere else to be?" "I had the quiche situation." "The quiche situation." It was a situation. Right. She looked at me properly. I'm asking because I'm going to get myself another drink and then go sit on the wall again, and if you're going to end up there anyway, you could just come now. Instead of the theater of it. I said, that's a reasonable point. She picked up the elderflower cordial and 2 glasses and handed one to me, and we walked back to the wall. That was when it started properly. The sitting. The wall was roughly the width of a plank, which meant we were a little closer than before, and the light had shifted to that late afternoon amber that is objectively very unfair to expose someone to when you are already having this kind of conversation. She told me about the fellowship. A painting, Dutch, 17th century, a domestic scene, a woman standing near a window, that had suffered water damage sometime in the 1980s and had been in careful storage ever since. She'd been brought in to assess whether restoration was possible. It had taken 6 months. And was it? I asked. Possible? Most of it. She stared at the roses. There's a section, about 6 inches across near the bottom right, where the paint was gone. Not damaged. Gone. You can't restore what isn't there. So what do you do with it? You leave it, she said. You fill in the ground and stabilize the edges and you leave it. Because anything you put there now is just your best guess at what someone else made, and that's not the same thing as the painting. She said it practically. Not sadly. But there was something in the specific example she'd chosen. 6 inches of something that couldn't be recovered, that I understood she wasn't only talking about the painting. That's honest work, I said. She looked at me sideways. Why do you say it like that? Because most people would try to fill it in. Pause. She turned her glass. Yeah, she said quietly. They would. And there it was, the 3rd near miss in 4 hours. She was looking at the garden, and I was looking slightly to the left of the garden, and the thing that wasn't being said was sitting between us on the wall, taking up approximately the same space as a person. I said, how long are you in Bristol? I leave tomorrow evening. 12 words. Very simple 12 words. They landed like the 4th quiche, quiet and definitive. Right? I said. Yeah, she said. Hold on a second, I need to know something. Where in the world are you listening to this right now? Drop it in the comments. People have been leaving locations from places I've never even thought about, and it means more than I can explain. Subscribe if you haven't yet, there's another story coming next week and you won't want to miss it. Okay, I'm back. I leave tomorrow evening. 12 words. And the weight on the left side of my chest quietly shifted another 2 inches and I let it because there was nothing else to do. Conservation work doesn't pull you back to Bristol? I said. Just to say something. My practice is in Edinburgh now. My flat. My life. She looked at me. You're going to ask me if I ever thought about moving back. I wasn't going to ask that. You were thinking it. I was thinking adjacent things. She almost smiled again. What things? Whether Edinburgh is actually better than Bristol or whether you just got used to it. She thought about it seriously. Both, she said. It's both. Pause. What would you do if you weren't here? Where would you go? I hadn't been asked that in a long time. I thought about it genuinely, which was unusual. Somewhere with old buildings, I said. I like old buildings. Not for the aesthetic, I like what they tell you. You can look at a wall and read 40 years of decisions in it. Who cut corners and when. What they were afraid of and what they were proud of. She had gone very still. What? I said. Nothing. She shook her head slowly. That's just, she stopped. What? That's a very specific thing to like about buildings. It sounds weird. It doesn't sound weird. She said it quickly. Then more carefully, it sounds like someone who pays very close attention to things. I moved the glass to my other hand. I did not look at her. June, I said. Don't, she said. I wasn't going to. You were going to say something sensible. A beat. I was going to say tomorrow evening is not until tomorrow evening. She was very quiet. I counted the dead roses she'd cleared from the front section of the fence. 7. That's not a sensible thing to say, she said. Very carefully. No, I agreed. Pete's dad started an argument about cricket somewhere to our left. One of the small children dropped something ceramic and it did not survive. The fairy lights came on, it had gotten darker than I'd noticed, the sky doing that slow English summer fade, and June looked up at them with the expression of someone who has just been offered something she is deciding whether to reach for. It's Margaret's birthday, she said. It is. I should probably circulate. You should. Neither of us moved. Are you going to be insufferable about this? She said. About which part? The part where we stay here instead of circulating. I looked at the fairy lights. Quietly insufferable, I said. I'll try to keep it contained. She laughed, actually laughed, short and genuine, and it sounded like something that didn't happen automatically. Like it had to be earned. The sound of it did something to my composure that I will not catalog in detail. Okay, she said. Quietly insufferable. Fine. It was another 40 minutes before anything significant happened, and what happened was this. Margaret came to find us. Margaret is 65, she has been Pete's mother for 37 years, and she knows everyone in that garden like she knows the garden itself, by pattern, by history, by which parts need tending. She arrived at the wall with a glass of Prosecco and a look that I recognized as the look of someone who has been watching something develop from a distance and has decided to make no comment about it whatsoever. There you both are, she said. Joel, I want to say thank you. For everything today. Just the gazebo, I said. You know that's not just what I mean. She looked at June with warmth that was also, somehow, assessment. He does this for us, you know. Whenever there's something. He just shows up. June looked at me sideways. The quiches, I said. 6 years, Margaret said serenely. He's been part of this family for 6 years whether he likes it or not. She patted my arm and moved on, carrying her Prosecco, and within 20 seconds was absorbed into another cluster. June was looking at me. 6 years, she said. About that. She called you part of the family. She calls everyone that eventually. It's a personality. She meant you. I had nothing to say to that. So I said nothing. You just show up, June said. Not mocking. Not gentle either. Just precise. It's the useful thing, I said. That thing you said earlier. About liking to be useful. Yes. Do you think that's enough? I looked at her. The fairy lights were reflected in the dark water of her eyes. I thought, this is a sentence I will remember. I thought, she is not asking idly. I thought it was, I said. She let that sit. Until, she said. Not a question either. It was June who said it. Of course it was June. She'd been saying true things all evening and this was just the last one. The garden had thinned, people drifting inside for cake, Pete managing his ants, the children finally apprehended. We were the last two at the wall. The roses had gone dark and the fairy lights were doing all the work. She said, I keep thinking about 6 inches. I looked at her. The painting, she said. The part that was gone. The part one couldn't put back. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the lights. I think about it more than I should. Not because I did something wrong, I didn't. But because that gap is just, it's always going to be there. It's part of what the painting is now. She paused. I haven't told that to anyone else, she said. It was quiet. I said, I moved a survey appointment 3 times last month. Same building. I'd done the initial assessment, I had everything I needed. I just kept finding reasons to go back. I looked at the fairy lights. It was a Victorian terrace. The kind where you can tell by the brickwork what year they stopped caring and what year they started again. She finally looked at me. You went back for a building, she said. I went back because I didn't want to close the file. She was very still. That's the same thing, she said. That's exactly the same thing. Not I like you. Not this has been something. Just, a painting with a gap in it and a building I kept going back to, and 2 people who recognized the metaphor in each other at the same time. I said, Edinburgh is a very good city. She said, it is. Bristol isn't that far. No, she said quietly. It isn't. Pause. And then, from inside the house, with absolutely no sense of timing whatsoever, Pete's Uncle Gary began singing Happy Birthday at full volume in the wrong key, a full 3 minutes before the cake was ready, and from somewhere in the kitchen Margaret said, Gary, the candles aren't even, and Gary sang regardless, and the small children began to clap, and through the window we could see the whole kitchen congregation beginning to laugh. June pressed her lips together. I said, he does this at every party. She said, everyone? Christmas as well. Sometimes Easter. She looked at me and this time the laugh happened all the way full and unguarded and she covered her mouth with the hand that had the ink smudge on the wrist and that was what I was going to think about. That specific thing. For a long time. If that just hit you the way it hit me every time I tell it, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. People have been finding these stories from every corner of the world, and I want to know your corner. Subscribe if you haven't. A new story lands every week. Now, let me finish this one. We went in for cake. That was it. That was the movement. She pushed herself off the wall and I pushed myself off the wall, and we went through the garden door into the warm yellow kitchen, and it was full of people and Prosecco and Margaret's face over 65 candles, and Gary still going in a slightly different wrong key. There was no declaration in the garden. There was no agreement. There was just two people walking inside together in the same direction because the cake was that way. Pete saw us come in. Pete said nothing. His face did quite a lot, but his mouth stayed appropriately closed, and I made a note to thank him later. The cake was a Victoria sponge, 2 tiers, cream and jam, slightly lopsided in the way homemade cakes are lopsided, which is the best way for a cake to be. Margaret blew out the candles on the second attempt, which meant she got her wish, she said, though she refused to tell anyone what it was while looking directly at no one in particular. I did not look at June. June did not look at me. We both looked at the cake with the expressions of two people who are performing very reasonable levels of interest in a cake. She cut me the first slice, which she handed over with one raised eyebrow that said, "You're going to overthink this." I took it. I did not overthink it. After the cake, the party began its slow collapse. The aunts finding coats, the children being cornelled, Gary being diplomatically steered toward the door by Pete's dad. I helped stack plates. June helped with glasses. We moved around each other in the kitchen with the comfortable competency of people who have navigated the same space before, which we hadn't, but it felt like we had. At some point Margaret, washing up at the sink, said without turning around, "June, you're welcome to stay the night, you know. The spare room's made up." "I've got a hotel," June said. "The offer stands." Margaret continued washing. "Joel could take you, couldn't you, Joel? He's going back that way." I was not going back that way. This is the thing about Margaret. She is not subtle, she is merely serene about it. "Sure," I said. June looked at me. "It's 20 minutes, I said. "I'll drop you." She held the look for a moment. Then, "All right." We said good night to everyone, which took longer than expected because Pete hugged me for approximately 6 seconds more than was necessary and whispered, "If you don't get her number I'm never forgiving you," directly into my ear, which was both helpful and mortifying. The car was quiet. Not an uncomfortable quiet, the kind of quiet that happens when you've already said the important things and don't need to fill the space. She'd given me the hotel name. I was driving toward it. The streetlights were doing the amber thing they do at midnight, and the city was very empty and very familiar. "I don't usually do this," I said. "Drive people to hotels at midnight? Talk to someone like this. On the day I met them." She looked out the window. "Neither do I." "Edinburgh," I said. "Yes," she said. "I have a survey in Leeds next month." She turned to look at me. "Leeds isn't Edinburgh. Leeds is 3 hours from Edinburgh by train." She was quiet. "That's a perfectly reasonable amount of train," I said. She made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite not. "You're terrible at this," she said warmly. "I know. I haven't done it in a while." "Me either." Pause. 3 hours isn't bad. I pulled up outside the hotel. Left the engine running because it felt important not to turn it off. The hotel was a sensible mid-range thing with a revolving door that someone had left in the wrong position. "June?" I said. "Joel," she said. "Can I have your number?" Not a question. I'd said it the same flat way she'd said the first thing, as a statement, not a request. I heard it come out of my mouth and thought, she's infected me with her way of speaking. She looked at me for a long moment. The amber light did the thing it was going to do. "Yes," she said. She typed it into my phone. Handed it back. I looked at the name she'd entered, June, the garden wall. "In case you forget the context," she said. I was not going to forget the context. Just being thorough. She got out of the car. Took 3 steps toward the revolving door. Turned around. "Joel." "Yeah. The Victorian terrace you kept going back to." She held my gaze. "I hope you closed that file eventually." I looked at her. "Working on it," I said. She smiled, fully, finally, the one that had been waiting all evening. Then she turned and walked through the revolving door, which was still in the wrong position and required her to push it twice, which she did without commentary, and then she was inside, and I sat in the car for what I will describe as a reasonable amount of time before driving home. The first time I went to Edinburgh, I told myself it was because Leeds ran over schedule and the train north was convenient. I was lying. The train to Leeds runs south. She met me at Waverley Station wearing a coat with a broken button she hadn't got around to fixing, and she showed me the studio where she worked, a long, pale room with north-facing windows and a smell of varnish remover and clean linen, and she showed me the Dutch painting which was in a frame on a stand by the far window. Domestic scene, a woman near light. And in the lower right corner, a small pale section. 6 inches. I stood in front of it for a while without speaking. It's still a remarkable painting, I said. Yes, she said. The gap doesn't diminish it. She was quiet beside me. No, she said finally. It doesn't. 3 months after that, she came to Bristol for a long weekend that started on a Friday and ended on a Tuesday, with nobody commenting on the arithmetic. I took her to the Victorian terrace. I don't know why, it was a completed file, nothing to show, just a house on a quiet street with a particularly well-laid Flemish bond brickwork pattern and a chimney someone had repointed in the 80s with the wrong mortar. She stood on the pavement looking at it with the same focused attention she gave to paintings, head slightly tilted. There, she said, pointing to the chimney. 90s actually, I said. The mortar's Portland. They stopped using lime by then. She looked at me. You care about this very specifically. I told you. I like what buildings tell you. You told me that on the day we met. I know. She took my hand. Didn't comment on it. Just, her hand in mine, standing on a pavement looking at a chimney. Like it was something we'd been doing for years. We did the distance for 14 months, which was not easy and was entirely worth it. She came to Bristol more. I went to Edinburgh more. We learned each other's cities like we were studying for an exam we both wanted to pass. She moved south 18 months after the garden party. Not to Bristol immediately, to Bath, which was close enough to be practical and far enough to be a decision she was making for herself, not just for me. 2 years in, I proposed at the kitchen table in her flat in Bath, with no planning whatsoever, while she was eating toast and reading something about pigment degradation in Northern European panel paintings. I said, I'd like to close the file. She looked up. The Victorian Terrace file, I said. The building I kept going back to. I'd like to close it. She stared at me. I had a ring. I'd been carrying it for 3 weeks waiting for a moment that felt like the right moment, and then I realized the right moment was this one. Not a restaurant, not a view, not a speech. Just her at her table in the morning with toast and a paper she was actually reading, and me across from her saying the only thing I had to say. She covered her mouth with her hand. The ink smudge was gone. It had been replaced by a different one, smaller, higher up. She never didn't have one. You are terrible at this, she said, eyes bright. I know, I said. Is that a yes? It is so obviously a yes, she said. We still tell people about the party differently depending on who's asking. Pete's version is long and involves himself as a central figure, which is inaccurate but not entirely unfair. Roberta insists she was instrumental. She was not. Our version is 2 lines. People ask, how did you meet? June says, he dropped 4 quiches on the grass and left one of them there. And I say she was the one who noticed. If you made it to the end, thank you. Genuinely. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from. I read every single one and every location surprises me. If this story found you at the right time, subscribe. A new one arrives every week. I'll see you in the next one.